Racist cop handcuffed a Navy veteran at her father's funeral. What she uncovered next shocked the nation. Have you ever watched someone's world fall apart at their father's funeral? Have you ever seen justice twist into something unrecognizable right in front of your eyes? If you think you've heard it all, wait until the end of this story, because the moment she showed her badge, they laughed, and minutes later she was in handcuffs. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? We love knowing where this story is reaching people. Now close your eyes. Imagine a quiet cemetery, soft footsteps on wet grass, and a folded American flag in trembling hands. Serena Bennett had just buried her father, a Navy veteran, who served his country with everything he had. And for a moment, despite the pain, there was peace. Until the officer showed up. Until the questions started. Until her identity was not just challenged, but erased. This is not just a story about one woman. It's a story about memory, about power, about what happens when you stand up for who you are and the world tries to shove you down, and the ending. You won't see it coming. It was supposed to be a quiet goodbye, the kind of farewell where grief and honor hold hands beneath the open sky. The sun had just started to break through the clouds that morning, casting a soft light over the cemetery lawn, where flags waved gently in the breeze. Friends, family, and veterans stood in silence around the casket of Walter Bennett, a decorated Navy officer who had given his life to the service of a country he believed in. Standing at the front, holding tightly to the folded flag pressed to her chest, was his daughter, Serena Bennett, 36 years old, a Navy veteran herself, strong, proud, grieving. And then came the sound no one expected, not a prayer, not a salute, but the sharp metallic clink of handcuffs. It happened fast. Too fast. Two officers approached Serena just as the minister cleared his throat to speak. They asked for her ID, then they asked again. They said the badge she wore, her own DEA credentials, looked fake, that her presence at the ceremony was suspicious. And before anyone could even raise a voice, they grabbed her arms, turned her around, and locked the cuffs tight around her wrists. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. A mother clutched her child. An older veteran removed his cap in disbelief. No one moved. No one could believe what they were seeing. And Serena stood frozen, not in fear but in heartbreak, her father's flag slipping slightly from her arms as she struggled to understand, to breathe. This wasn't just an arrest, it was an erasure, a public stripping of her identity, her dignity, her truth, right in front of the people who loved and respected her. A daughter bearing her father treated like a criminal for simply existing in her own skin, in her own uniform. And as the murmurs turned to shouts and phones came out to record, the funeral was no longer about honoring a hero. It became something else entirely. A stage for a tragedy that should never have happened. A moment where silence was shattered by the sound of justice gone wrong. I serve this country. That's what Serena said, her voice calm but firm, her hands still cuffed, her shoulders squared like the officer she was trained to be. She looked the young patrolman in the eye as she spoke. I'm a veteran. This badge is real. This ID is real. I've done nothing wrong. But her words floated into the air like smoke and disappeared. The officer didn't even glance at the card she held out. His fingers brushed it aside with a smirk, as if her identity, her service, her sacrifice, none of it mattered. Anyone can buy one of those online, and he muttered, doesn't mean it's real. The implication was loud even in a whisper. He didn't see her uniform. He didn't hear her rank. He didn't care about her duty. All he saw was a black woman, standing at a funeral, wearing a badge he didn't believe she could possibly earn. This wasn't just disrespect. This was disbelief. A denial so deep it stripped Serena of the very thing she had built her life on her honor. She tried again, explained where she had served, mentioned her clearance, her deployments, her record. But with every word, the officer's expression hardened. He'd already decided. The narrative in his mind was louder than her truth. And it's not just Serena. She's not the first, and she won't be the last. In 2014, retired Army Sergeant First Class Alan Thomas, also black, was detained at an airport because a TSA agent didn't believe his military ID was authentic. In 2017, Lieutenant Commander Cheryl Dorsey, a decorated black officer with decades of service, was pulled over and questioned for driving in a nice neighborhood. She was in uniform. Still, they assumed she didn't belong. These moments aren't accidents. They're symptoms. There's a deeper sickness here. One that says if you're a person of color, your credentials are suspect. Your achievements are temporary. Your presence needs to be explained. That even if you've risked your life under the same flag, it still might not be enough to earn you basic respect. This is what happens when bias wears a badge, when unconscious racism becomes standard operating procedure, when protect and serve quietly shifts into profile and suspect, and it's dangerous. Because in the eyes of someone who refuses to see your worth, your uniform won't save you. Your stripes don't shield you. Your silence won't help you. Serena Bennett's story is a reflection of that broken trust, a mirror held up to a system that still asks people like her to prove again and again that they belong, even at a funeral, even when they've served. And as she stood there, handcuffed, humiliated, dismissed, Serena realized something that so many have learned the hard way. Sometimes the battlefield isn't overseas, it's right here at home. And the fight, oh man, is just to be seen. It all began with a voice, no face, no name, just a call, quick, sharp, and loaded with accusation. She's impersonating a DEA agent. That was all it took. One anonymous tip to dispatch, and the machinery moved. No one asked who the caller was. No one questioned the motive. They just acted. And Serena, she had no idea she was already marked, already judged, already set up to fail. The officer who approached her at her father's funeral didn't just see a woman in mourning. He saw a suspect. Because someone somewhere decided she should be one. With no evidence, no proof, just a whisper through a phone line. And it wasn't a stranger's voice. It didn't feel random. It felt targeted, deliberate, calculated. And that's the part that cuts deepest, because Serena had been careful. Everything about her was by the book. Her credentials, her movements, her presence at the cemetery. Yet all of it was undone by one unchecked call. What kind of system gives that much power to a ghost? You see, anonymous tips are supposed to be a tool, a way to protect, to inform, to help law enforcement act quickly when lives are at risk. But in the wrong hands, they become something else entirely a weapon. And history proves that. In the case of Breonna Taylor, a no-knock raid was approved based on vague and questionable intel, some of it linked to prior anonymous calls. She was in her bed, unarmed, innocent. Still, she lost her life in a matter of seconds, all because the system didn't stop to verify, didn't ask enough questions, trusted hearsay over human life. In Serena, she didn't lose her life, but in that moment she lost her dignity, her credibility, her right to grieve in peace. And why? Because someone knew how to trigger a response, knew that the right phrase impersonating a federal officer would spark instant action. It worked. And it raises a terrifying question. What if that someone wasn't a stranger? What if the voice behind the call knew exactly who Serena was? What if it came from inside the system? Maybe someone from the force, maybe someone with a grudge, or maybe someone who just didn't believe a black woman could carry that badge without stealing it. And if that's true, then this wasn't just a mistake, it was sabotage. It was a trap designed to humiliate her in the most sacred moment of her life. Her father's funeral. Think about that. The very man who taught her discipline, who stood proud when she joined the Navy, who wore his own uniform with honor, was being laid to rest. And instead of mourning, Serena was being frisked, questioned, handcuffed, while the man who raised her was lowered into the ground. This isn't just about one call, it's about a system that listens to the wrong voices, that moves fast when it hears fear, but freezes when asked for fairness. And until we fix that, until we put safeguards in place to trace, verify, and hold accountable, every voice that weaponizes our trust, then anyone can be the next Serena. All it takes is a phone call, no name, no face, just a lie, and a system ready to believe it. Officer Cole didn't hesitate. His boots hit the grass with force. His voice cut through the air, cold and commanding. He moved with certainty, with authority, like everything was already decided, no questions needed, no facts required. To him, Serena was just another case, another box to check, Another perceived threat to neutralize, but Officer Marks, he moved slower. His eyes scanned more than just the badge. He looked at Serena's face, at the tremble in her hands, at the way her body trembled not from guilt, but from grief. And something inside him hesitated. Cole barked orders, grabbed the cuffs, tightened them like he was in a war zone. He didn't see the Navy insignia on Serena's lapel. He didn't notice the folded flag clutched in her hand. He didn't care. To Cole, it was all black and white. A report came in. The woman matched the description. That was enough. No room for doubt, no space for dignity. He believed in rules, but only when they made him feel powerful. Marks, on the other hand, believed in something else. He believed in doubt. And on that day, doubt started to grow in his gut like a storm on the horizon. Because the woman he saw didn't fit the profile. Her ID matched. Her eyes were clear. Her grief, real. And as Cole pushed forward with force, Marks took a mental step back. That's the difference between following orders and following your conscience. Every system has both. The Coles of the world move like machines, programmed, precise, convinced they're on the side of justice, even when they're hurting the wrong people. They never stop to ask, what if I'm wrong? Because that kind of question cracks their armor. And they can't afford cracks. Then there are the Markses, the ones who carry a badge, but not at the expense of their humanity. The ones who feel the weight of every decision, who notice the trembling hands, the folded flag, the tear-stained uniform. And they pause not because they're weak, but because they understand power is dangerous when used without reflection. In that moment, Marks didn't stop Cole, not yet. He stood there, silent, uncertain, watching Serena being pushed to the ground, her father's burial happening just yards away, watching her plead, watching her bleed emotionally, spiritually, and he didn't move. That silence, it's where the real failure begins. Because evil doesn't always announce itself with a shout. Sometimes it slips through the cracks left by good people who don't speak up, who see wrong but choose comfort, who whisper to themselves, this doesn't feel right, but never say it out loud. That's how systems break, not just from those who abuse power, but from those who don't question it. Cole didn't doubt, Marks did, but Marks said nothing, not then, and that silence is louder than any shout. We've seen it before. In the George Floyd case, multiple officers stood by, watched, heard him cry out, knew something was wrong, but they didn't act. They stayed in their lane, followed the chain of command, and a man died in front of them. Why? Because training said to obey, because culture said to comply, because fear said to be quiet. So they were, just like Marks. But here's the thing about doubt, it doesn't go away. It grows. It lingers. It follows you home, into your car, into your dreams, and eventually it demands a reckoning. Marks felt that, the weight of it, the quiet shame of not stepping in, the guilt of being there and doing nothing. And from that moment on, he wasn't the same. Maybe he started asking questions. Maybe he opened a file he wasn't supposed to. Maybe he made a call. But it all started here, on the grass, at the funeral of a man who served his country with a daughter in handcuffs and one officer too cold to care, while the other finally started to feel the heat of his own conscience. 2 officers, 2 paths, and only one would lead to justice. It started with a single tap. The camera lens on a smartphone caught the moment Serena was shoved to her knees, her hands twisted behind her back, her cries dignified but broken, cut through the air. One of the mourners, a young woman standing off to the side, had the instinct to hit record, not to interfere, not because she wanted views, but because she knew deep down this wasn't right, and someone needed to remember what happened. Someone needed to witness the truth. She didn't say a word. She didn't move closer. She just kept filming. 10 seconds, then 20. Then a full minute of raw, gut-wrenching silence broke, enchanted by the sound of cuffs and disbelief. Later that day, the video made its way online, and it didn't just ripple, it exploded. Within hours, the clip had over 100,000 views. By morning, it had hit 2 million. By nightfall, the hashtags were everywhere. #Justice for Serena, #Honor the Uniform, #Racism in Blue. News outlets picked it up. Celebrities reposted it. Civil rights groups launched calls to action. And suddenly the quiet shame of a funeral turned into a national firestorm. People watched not just because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. Too familiar. The image of a black woman in uniform restrained on sacred ground reignited conversations that never really left. About power, about race, about what it means to serve your country and still not be believed. The comment sections filled with fury. She showed her ID. Why wasn't that enough? She wore the uniform. Why? Why was she treated like a suspect? Why does this keep happening? And deeper still, beneath the hashtags and headlines lay a chilling realization that without this video, Serena's voice might have been lost. Her experience dismissed. Her story buried next to her father. Because that's the power of video. It holds the truth in a way words sometimes can't. We saw it with Eric Garner, his last breath caught on camera as he gasped, "I can't breathe." That footage shook the country, made us look, made us listen. We saw it again with George Floyd, with Sandra Bland, with Philando Castile, moments frozen in digital memory, moments that forced conversations no matter how uncomfortable. And now Serena, a Navy veteran, a daughter in mourning, a woman whose grief was treated as a threat. The internet didn't let this go, because social media, for all its flaws, became her courtroom. It became her amplifier. And in the echo of millions of clicks and shares, her story became more than just an incident. It became a movement. But with virality comes pressure. Suddenly, the local police department was swamped with calls. Emails flooded City Hall. Protesters gathered with signs reading, "She served," "You shamed." And the officers involved no longer anonymous, their faces screenshot and shared. Their names trending alongside demands for accountability. Cole, Marks, the precinct, the mayor. No one could hide behind bureaucracy anymore because the video told its own truth. It didn't need editing. It didn't need commentary. It showed a woman kneeling not in salute but in pain. And no amount of spin could change that. This wasn't just about Serena. It was about every unseen moment, every unrecorded act of quiet discrimination. Every time someone said, "Are you sure that's what happened?" or "He was just doing his job," the internet gave Serena her voice back. But more than that, it gave her an army. People from across the country began sharing their own stories. Veterans of color who'd been profiled, women in uniform who'd been dismissed, families who'd lost someone not in combat, but in confrontation. The stories poured in, the outrage grew, and through it all, Serena stayed quiet. Because for her, this wasn't about fame. It was about dignity, about memory, about a flag she'd served under, and the man she'd just buried. And maybe that's what hit people hardest, that the most patriotic person at that cemetery was the one in handcuffs. As the days passed, the video continued to circulate. New angles emerged. Another mourner had filmed from a different spot. Someone else had audio of the officer mocking Serena's ID. A third person uploaded a slow-motion breakdown of the exact moment her hands were pulled behind her. And with each upload, the truth grew louder. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a moment of injustice. And the internet, this vast, messy, relentless machine, refused to let it be forgotten. Because sometimes the camera doesn't just record what happened. Sometimes it becomes the reason change begins. She had worn the uniform with pride. Through dust heat, blood, and bone. Serena Bennett wasn't just another veteran, she had been a leader, a decorated officer, a healer on the front lines. Years ago in a combat zone near Kandahar, she led a medical unit that saved over 24 Marines during a surprise insurgent attack. For her courage, she was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. That day, she didn't think about race or politics or what people might assume when they looked at her. She thought only about duty, about life, about doing what needed to be done. But none of that mattered on the day of her father's funeral. To Officer Cole, she wasn't a veteran. She wasn't a daughter in mourning. She wasn't a woman with service stripes and a chest full of ribbons. She was just another black woman holding a badge he decided not to believe. The pain wasn't just in the arrest. It was in the erasure, the quiet deletion of everything she had lived, fought, and nearly died for. When Serena's full military record came to light, circulated online by veteran advocacy groups, people were stunned. She wasn't exaggerating, she wasn't pretending. Her credentials were real, her history undeniable. But it had been denied anyway. In that denial, it cut deeper than the handcuffs. Because for many black veterans, this wasn't new. Ask James, an Air Force pilot turned engineer, who was once pulled over in front of his own house and accused of stealing his own car. Ask Monica, a Purple Heart recipient who was told at a grocery store that can't be your uniform. Ask hundreds more whose accomplishments were never questioned on paper, but dismissed in person. What happened to Serena reopened an old wound in America's relationship with its soldiers. Because we love to thank them for their service as long as they fit a certain image. But the moment that image challenges expectations, when the veteran is a woman or black, or speaks out against injustice, that gratitude often vanishes. Serena had led troops. She had rebuilt clinics. She had mentored young corpsmen who called her ma'am with pride and respect. But that history wasn't seen. Or maybe it was seen and ignored. And in that moment, in front of a headstone and a grieving family, her legacy was reduced to suspicion. That's the cruelty of unconscious bias. It doesn't just misjudge. It deletes. It takes medals and turns them into props. It turns IDs into possible fakes. It turns decorated service into scenes of humiliation. And the most painful part, Serena wasn't surprised. Angry, yes. Devastated. Of course. But surprised, not really, because this wasn't the first time. Back in 2015, during a layover at an airport, TSA agents pulled her aside for random inspection. They didn't believe the military ID was hers. She had to call a superior officer to confirm it on the spot. In 2018, she applied for housing assistance reserved for veterans. A clerk looked at her paperwork, blinked, and said, "Are you sure you didn't mean to apply for single mother support?" Each time her reality was questioned. Her dignity chipped away. Until that day at the cemetery, when it broke completely. But her story struck a chord, because it wasn't just about her. It was about the systemic disbelief that follows so many who don't look the way society expects its heroes to look. And once the internet connected the dots, once Serena's record, her arrest, her silence, and her service all aligned, a wave of fury turned into a flood of solidarity. Veterans groups rallied behind her. Senators and representatives called for hearings. Op-eds were written. Memorials were held. Because Serena's truth illuminated a darker truth, that valor doesn't guarantee validation. That no matter how much you give, some still see your skin before they see your story. And in the heart of that storm, Serena chose not to hide. She spoke quietly at first. A statement, then a letter to fellow service members. Then finally a televised interview, her first words broadcast across the nation. "I wore the uniform because I believed in something bigger than myself," she said. "I never expected that belief to be thrown back in my face. But I won't let this define me. My service is not a question mark." And it never was. Those words echoed, not just through newsrooms and online posts, but in the hearts of veterans who had felt invisible for years. Because her arrest was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And the lesson that respect earned through sacrifice shouldn't be conditional. That a medal should be enough. That a badge of service should mean something regardless of who wears it. Because until it does, we're not truly honoring anyone. Inside the cold, fluorescent-lit halls of the precinct, the silence was no longer just silence. It was tension. Thick, unspoken crackling in the air like a storm waiting to erupt. After the incident at the cemetery, the officers of the Springdale Police Department weren't just avoiding eye contact. They were avoiding a reckoning. Sergeant Daniels was the first to say it out loud. "I don't think we got this one right." That sentence, spoken in the briefing room over lukewarm coffee and the hum of a malfunctioning AC unit, split the room in two. On one side were those who stood by Cole. They didn't necessarily believe he'd done the right thing, but they believed in the chain of command, in protocol, in loyalty. They muttered words like procedure, reasonable suspicion, and don't throw your brother under the bus. On the other side, officers like Marks, who had been there, who had seen Serena's face as the cuffs went on, couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just about one arrest. It was about what they were becoming. Marks couldn't sleep. He rewatched the footage over and over. Not the viral clip, but the body cam footage. The moment when Serena softly said, "I'm just here to bury my father," and Cole didn't even blink. When she showed her ID and it was tossed aside like junk mail. When nobody stopped it. And that was the problem. It wasn't just about what Cole did. It was about what nobody else did. The debate moved from whispered corners to full-blown arguments in locker rooms and hallways. Some officers walked out of meetings early. Others left printed articles on desks, stories about the blue wall of silence, about officers who lost their careers for speaking out. In the break room, two lieutenants nearly came to blows. "This isn't about race," one snapped. "It's about protocol." "No," the other replied, "it's about basic human decency." The department chief tried to hold things together. A closed-door meeting. An apology drafted, then retracted. A statement to the media full of vague phrases under internal review, committed to transparency, respecting the process. But the officers knew. There was a line being drawn and everyone would have to pick a side. The cracks in the brotherhood were not just ideological. They were personal. Because deep down, every cop in that building had a moment at some point in their career where they had watched something happen and said nothing. Not all of them were proud of that. Some had buried that guilt. Others were now digging it up, forced to confront what it meant to wear a badge. Officer Riley, 15 years on the force, told a rookie in hushed tones, "What Cole did, that's the kind of thing that gets cops killed. Not by bullets, by silence, by rot." And still others clung tighter to the wall of silence. Not because they believed Cole was right, but because they believed that turning on one of their own was worse than any mistake he could have made. That was the tragedy. This wasn't just Serena's story anymore. It was the story of a department eating itself from the inside. The public, meanwhile, watched every move. News vans camped outside. Activists posted live streams calling out officers by name. Rumors swirled that Marks was going to turn whistleblower, that Daniels had filed a formal complaint, that the DOJ was circling. But inside the department, the real war wasn't in the headlines. It was in the looks exchanged in elevators, in the sudden silence when someone walked into a room, in the new reality that brotherhood didn't mean what it used to, because now there were questions. And more than that, there was shame. Some officers wondered if it had been a white woman in a Navy uniform, would things have gone the same way they knew the answer? They just didn't want to say it out loud. And that is where culture breaks. Not in explosions, but in erosion. Slow, relentless, inevitable. And it all started with one woman. A woman who stood quietly by her father's casket. A woman who wore a badge and served her country. A woman who simply by refusing to bow her head, forced a department to look in the mirror. And for the first time in a long time, some of them didn't like what they saw. Because justice doesn't just happen in courtrooms. It happens or it dies in places like that precinct, in whispered questions, in quiet courage, in the choice to speak or to stay silent. Late one evening under the flickering lights of the Internal Affairs Office, the first pieces of the truth began to surface. Not from press conferences, not from leaked videos, but from a quiet trail of phone logs, disciplinary reports, and one unsigned complaint. The department had launched the investigation, reluctantly pushed by public outrage and the glare of the media. But what started as a review of Serena Bennett's wrongful detainment quickly unraveled into something far darker. Something that wasn't just about one officer and one mistake. It was about a system built to bury the truth before it ever saw daylight. Serena had filed a complaint nearly 2 years ago. Back then, she had witnessed an officer, Paul Medina, rough-handling a young black teenager outside a gas station. No body cam footage, no media coverage. Just Serena stepping forward, filing an internal report, and expecting the system to do its job. It didn't. The case went nowhere. No follow-up, no hearing, nothing. But now, as investigators pulled back layers, they found something disturbing. The anonymous call that accused Serena of impersonating a DEA agent, it hadn't come from a civilian. It came from inside the department. Officer Medina, the same man she'd reported, the dots connected with brutal clarity he hadn't forgotten. And when Serena appeared again, this time in uniform, this time in public, he saw an opportunity to strike back. One call, one accusation, one lie, and the gears of a broken system turned without question. This wasn't random, it was retaliation, and Medina wasn't alone. Internal Affairs found messages, deleted emails, Slack channels where officers joked about teaching the Navy lady a lesson. Not everyone participated, but enough did to make one thing clear: this wasn't just personal vendetta. It was culture, a silent agreement that those who challenge the code will pay. As the news broke, shock rippled across the city. The mayor called it deeply troubling. The police chief called it isolated misconduct, but the public called it what it was: corruption. Serena didn't speak to the media right away. She didn't need to. The documents spoke for her. Pages of internal memos, records of complaints that vanished, names of officers who were protected again and again at the cost of justice. And as these truths poured into the open, more people came forward. A retired officer admitted he'd once been warned not to back up Serena's complaint. Bad politics, they told him. Don't get involved. A former dispatcher revealed she'd been asked to delete a call log. Each revelation painted a clearer picture. The issue wasn't just one bad apple, it was the orchard. Carefully managed, fiercely defended, and rooted in a belief that accountability was a threat, not a virtue. Cities like Chicago had faced this before. Baltimore, too. Reports of code of silence retaliation, especially against Black officers or those who stood against misconduct. It was never a surprise, but it was always devastating, because every system that allows this rot to grow is telling the public something. That truth is negotiable. That power will protect itself. And that integrity in the wrong uniform is dangerous. The investigation's report stretched over 160 pages. It named names, detailed cover-ups. But even that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most chilling moment came from a recording, an offhand comment made by an officer during a coffee break, caught by a surveillance mic. She should have kept her mouth shut. That's what you get when you forget your place. Forget your place. That wasn't just a threat to Serena. That was a warning to every cop of conscience, every soldier in blue who believed the badge was about service, not silence. Serena read the report alone in her apartment. She sat for hours, not crying, not angry, just quiet. Her father's photo on the mantle, her medals in a box on the floor. She had spent her life defending a country she believed in. And now she was watching that country wrestle with a truth it didn't want to face. They hadn't just tried to silence her. They tried to erase her. But the truth once spoken doesn't go back to sleep. It echoes, it grows, and this time it had been written down page by page for all to see. What came next would be up to the city, up to its leaders, and up to its people. But one thing was certain. No one could say they didn't know anymore. The streets of Fair Ridge hadn't seen this many people in decades. What began as a small, silent vigil on the courthouse steps, just a few candles, a few signs, quickly ignited into something much larger. By the end of the week, thousands filled the town square. Not just neighbors and friends, not just the people who knew Serena or served with her father, but veterans, students, grandmothers, activists, strangers. They came from across counties, across states, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath homemade banners that read, "Justice for Serena veterans deserve better, and protect our protectors." It started with a whisper, then a post, then a storm. When the video of Serena's arrest hit the internet, it spread fast. But when the truth about the anonymous call came out, about the retaliation, the cover-ups, the betrayal, something deeper cracked open in people's hearts. It wasn't just about Serena anymore. It was about all the unspoken stories, the injustices that never made the news, the veterans who came home to silence, the service members who were honored abroad but humiliated at home. Veteran organizations, some of the most disciplined, conservative voices in American life, issued rare statements condemning what had happened. The National Association of Black Veterans called it a disgrace to the values we wore the uniform for. Even groups that traditionally avoided political protests began to show up. They marched not in anger but in disappointment. And that disappointment was louder than any scream. Young people mobilized overnight. University campuses organized teach-ins forums and donation drives to support Serena's legal defense and amplify her story. Law students drafted legal memos. ROTC cadets wore patches in silent protest. Even high schoolers in nearby districts walked out of class holding hands in lines that stretched down empty streets. Cable news picked it up first. Then came the major networks. Morning anchors sat with former Navy doctors and retired officers trying to process how someone like Serena, decorated, disciplined, and grieving, could be treated like a threat in the place where her father was being laid to rest. Farage became a name that echoed far beyond its borders. Some tried to frame it as just another viral moment. But for many, it wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. And what they saw reflected back was years of pain. There were signs quoting the words of Philando Castile's mother. Marchers chanted the names of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Elijah McClain, names that had become symbols of lives interrupted by power unrestrained. But this protest had a different tone. It carried the discipline of military cadence and the sorrow of a family funeral. It was grief marching forward, orderly, united, relentless. And then came Selma. Yes, Selma. Veterans who had once stood at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965, now in their 70s and 80s, sent videos of solidarity from across the country. Some came in person. One man in his Marine dress blues told a reporter, "I marched once so my children could vote. Now I march so my grandchildren won't be afraid to wear a uniform." The power of that legacy gave weight to the movement. And it wasn't without resistance. Counter-protesters arrived. Online trolls unleashed their bile. The department issued statements trying to control the narrative. They called for unity while refusing to name the officers involved. They asked for peace while denying that anything systemic had gone wrong. But the people knew better. Unity without accountability is just silence. And peace without truth is just surrender. As the protest grew, city after city joined in, from Seattle to Savannah. In front of the courthouses, state capitals, and veteran memorials, Serena's face, once blurred behind handcuffs, now stood 10 feet tall on murals. Her story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had been doubted, dismissed, or disrespected after serving with honor. This wasn't the kind of story that faded with a trending hashtag. It was the kind of story that took root, the kind that shifted conversations at dinner tables in boardrooms and within precinct walls. Because if a woman like Serena Bennett wasn't safe, who was? And when those who swore to serve began to speak up, not just in anger, but with clarity and purpose, it became clear that the ground was shifting. This protest wasn't chaos. It was a call to consciousness. And now the whole country was listening. The Capitol felt different that day, not because of who sat inside, but because of who stood before them. Serena Bennett, once a grieving daughter in handcuffs, once a silent casualty of institutional failure, now stood at the podium, eyes steady, voice clear. Every word she spoke wrapped in dignity. Behind her were photos of her father in uniform. In front of her were lawmakers, veterans, activists, and a nation finally ready to listen. And when she spoke, it wasn't anger that filled the room. It was resolve. Serena didn't ask for revenge. She didn't point fingers or raise her voice. Instead, she told the truth. The kind of truth that makes people uncomfortable. The kind that forces systems to look inward. She spoke of justice not as punishment, but as healing. Not as retribution, but as recognition. She shared stories of others like her. Black veterans pushed aside women in uniform, silent service members questioned on sight simply because of their skin. And then she made a promise that this moment would not end with applause. It would begin with change. Outside those walls, the world kept watching. Sergeant Cole had already been indicted. The investigation revealed years of misconduct, ignored warnings, and a culture that rewarded silence. His trial was still ahead, but the verdict in the court of public opinion had already been delivered. Yet Serena refused to celebrate his downfall. Justice, she said, isn't about breaking someone. It's about building something better. That belief shaped everything that came next. Serena launched a national campaign for policing reform focused on veteran rights and racial accountability. She worked with lawmakers to propose the Bennett Act, a bill designed to train officers in recognizing veteran credentials and de-escalating conflicts with empathy, not force. She partnered with military organizations to educate recruits about their rights, their worth, and their power beyond the battlefield. And she kept showing up. At high schools, at town halls, on late-night shows, on military bases, on podcasts and front pages and Sunday morning panels, not for fame, but because she knew her father would have done the same, because somewhere another daughter was standing at her father's grave and she deserved better. Serena became more than a headline. She became a movement, and still she made it personal. She visited the cemetery where it all began. No cameras, just quiet. She stood by her father's headstone, placed her hand gently on the stone and whispered, "We're okay now, Daddy. They know who you were, and they know who I am." Because it was never just about Serena. It was about every life disrespected, every uniform ignored, every act of service forgotten the moment it was inconvenient. It was about restoring the promise that dignity doesn't come with conditions, that justice doesn't wear a clock, that truth doesn't need permission to be told. And she told it. To the country, to the courts, to the conscience of a system that had lost its way. But this ending wasn't hers alone. It's ours. It belongs to every voice that rose up in protest, every hand that held a sign, every officer who broke the silence, every young person who asked, "What can I do?" and meant it. The truth is, Serena's victory didn't come from a courtroom. It came from the crowd. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real change begins. So if you're still here, still listening, I want you to remember this. They put a war hero in handcuffs, but she didn't break. She built a revolution. Now hit that subscribe button, because the stories they don't want you to hear, those are the ones we'll never stop telling.